This is the DFS First Look Podcast, breaking down everything you need to know for daily fantasy sports in 15 minutes. This is your host, Joshua Schwager.
Welcome, everybody, to the first episode of the DFS First Look Podcast. In today's 15-game slate, we have a lot of options. Some options may surprise you as the hot hands actually look to prove their worth from this point going forward. It should be no surprise to you that Max Scherzer is the front runner on today's game, like he is every single time he's been up this year by my projection model. Max Scherzer has a 1.8 K to inning ratio and has a pitcher score of 37.7. It's no surprise that someone with such a high amount of strikeout potential at every single inning and can go late into the game against a decent opponent actually is going to be the number one option on today's game. I mean, Toronto is a solid offense, not enough to actually turn you away from him. The second option of the day is obviously Johnny Cueto, who is going up against the Philadelphia Phillies, who aren't exactly the best team in the land. I mean, early in the year we talked about how often they strike out, and that's not normally the case right now. They're actually striking out quite a bit less, but he's close to striking out one person every inning and can take you 8 to 9 innings a game. I don't see why you wouldn't take Johnny Cueto in a cash game type setup with his production levels. I mean, he does have a low BIBIP at 253, so you could expect it to go up, but with a K9 of 8.27 versus the Phillies, he's not going to deviate all that much. The third option on today's slate, in Lance Lynn, actually gets a boost because of, the Milwaukee Brewers. I hate to say it, Carlos Gomez, Ryan Braun are great, but when you just look at Lance Lynn's raw stuff, you just begin to see how he can just surprisingly get that high pitching score with a high strikeout ratio and how few home runs he gives up throughout the year. And it's just kind of the pitching park that he's in compared to someone like Chris Archer against the Los Angeles Angels. When you begin to look at Chris Archer, you really do see an ace, a full ace. He has everything you might need and everything you might want in a pitcher. But against the Angels, it's just a hard sell. I mean, he looks good in his 48 at-bats against the Angels. He's limited them to a 2.29 batting average and only one home run. But it just seems more like a GPP play. He'll get his share. He won't be the worst option in cash play. But in all honesty, I don't like him for anything other outside of tournament today. I think if in cash play you're looking at the Scherzers, the Cuetos of the world, maybe some Shelly Miller play, or Noah Syndergaard, Zach Greinke, Chris Heston. There's plenty of cash options out there, and I kind of label Chris Archer as a GPP option. Chris Archer is number 4, and number 5 and number 6 on my slate might actually surprise you. Jimmy Nelson has such a good strikeout potential at 1.2 strikeouts an inning right now. I mean, his xFIP is around 3.87 and his FIP is around 3.9. He has a low BIBIP and an average K9 of about 7.94. I mean, it's not the greatest setup in the world, but he has the strikeout potential, and at a price that's pretty cheap to actually get you moving in the right direction at a cheaper cost. I like Jimmy Nelson as my 5th option on the day. I think he gives you plenty of upside. He's just like Chris Archer, he's a GPP play only, but that's just where he stands. Noah Syndergaard as the 6th option on the day actually makes a lot of sense. He went 7+ innings in his last game and boasts a 2.92 BIPIP and a 75% left on base percentage. Those numbers don't suggest that what he's going through is anything like a fluke. I mean, he has a 3-pitch arsenal, a fastball, kind of mixed with a 2-seam fastball, a changeup, and a curveball. His 2-seam fastball needs a lot of improvement right now on his weighted fastball. It's at a negative 7.54. That's not good. But when you look at that in comparison to his dominant curveball, his curveball is actually probably taking a step forward just because of the amount of times he's throwing his fastball around 66%. I mean, he's limiting lefties to 177 average. I mean, lefties aren't hitting him well. And today he goes up against the San Diego Padres in a lineup that actually boosts his overall potential. I think I really like Noah Syndergaard today, even in cash settings. He's projected for the loss, but that doesn't change too much. Without the win, I have him projected right around 24 points, which is great. That is great for the value that you're paying for him. I mean, other options you can look at today include Zach Greinke, Shelby Miller, but we don't really have to talk about them too much. We kind of know what's coming and what's expected of them. They're not going to have the worst outings in the world. Sometimes Shelby Miller has the best outing on the day, but Zach Greinke, if you remember the statistic that was being thrown around a lot last year, he had the most consecutive outings of 6 innings pitched, limiting under 2 runs. I mean, he is just a solid ace through and through. I mean, he's not the elite ace, but if he was my number 1 on a team, I would feel comfortable throwing him out there against anybody. So I would look at Zach Greinke against Colorado as a cash play, even though it is against Colorado in Colorado. He's not that bad of an option. Now, when we begin to look past this, we see a guy named Jeff Samardzija that actually kind of sticks out at you at the projections. I have him at a 27.86 pitcher score, which is ridiculous for what he's done this year. I would actually target Jeff Samardzija just because of how hot the Texas Rangers are getting. I mean, Samardzija does strike out a bunch. The Texas Rangers did have a bad beginning of the year, but right now they're not struggling all that much. I mean, if you're going to look at BVP, which I never really suggest you looking into too much, but you begin to see this character named Josh Hamilton appear. I mean, he has only 6 plate appearances against Jeff Samardzija, so don't look at it too much, but he has 2 home runs in those 6 appearances. I mean, as cheap as Josh Hamilton is, you got to begin to look at him against a guy like Jeff Samardzija in a game that you would actually think they win. I mean, Prince Fielder has a high with on base percentage against him, and I think that I wouldn't go after Jeff Samardzija as a pitcher tomorrow unless you're trying to get in that variance level, because I don't think many people are going to be targeting him as a pitcher to use, but rather a pitcher to go against. I really like a lot of the Rangers against him, even though I have Jeff Samardzija at the number 4. Now, speaking of pitchers to target with hitters, I think you got to look at Phil Hughes. Back to the almost worthless BVP stats, Dustin Pedroia sticks out at you. I mean, 5 home runs, 342 average, 8 extra base hits on 40 plate appearances. I think I would take him. I would look at a lot of the Boston Red Sox to perform well against Phil Hughes. I mean, when you look at his 4.59 ERA and the fact that he's already given up 12 home runs on this year, 3 multi-hit home run games have been against him, and he's playing in Boston. It doesn't spell much of more of a stack than this. I mean, you have to be targeting Phil Hughes in GPP. You have to be stacking against him if you believe in the stack. Now, speaking of GPP, we got to look at a couple other GPP options. The primary one that I'm looking at right now is Mike Wright, outside of guys, like Jimmy Nelson and Chris Archer that I've already talked about, Noah Syndergaard. I'm looking at Mike Wright. His ERA is at 1.4. That's not going to last. I mean, his xFIP is around 3.93, but he only has a K9 of 5.59. It's not that good, but he's going against the Astros. And if you don't know this, the Astros strike out a bunch. I would imagine at the cheap price that you can get Mike Wright across any platform that you could expect somewhere around 6 2/3 innings with about 6 Ks, maybe giving up a run. That's kind of what you can get, and at that price tag, that's really, really, really worth it. All right, so past the pitching, we have to look at the hitters now. So the strongest hitter projected on today's games is Nelson Cruz versus CC Sabathia, where he's only a lifetime 2.14 average with 0 home runs against him, but come on, let's face it, Nelson Cruz has an alarming 885 weighted on base versus lefties and a 955 ISO. Yeah, you're going to play Nelson Cruz every single chance you get against a lefty. It's just how it's going to happen. You just have to. I mean, you could label him as a GPP play just because of his history, but I'm going to be taking Nelson Cruz wherever I can take him. As usual, we should be looking to stack against Jeremy Guthrie, who already is struggling on the year, but Guthrie has a lifetime 266 plate appearances versus the current Cleveland roster and is already averaging 327 average against the Cleveland Indians. Ouch. Jason Kipnis alone this year has a weighted on base percentage of 442 against right-handed throwers. That should be a lock in your cash play games. Outside of that, you should be looking at Adrian Gonzalez. Today he leads all first basemen by bolstering a .346 ISO and a .458 weighted on base average. Match those numbers with an increased ratings in Coors Field, and you're looking at a potential monster game for Adrian Gonzalez. The Red Sox look to put a pounding on Phil Hughes, like I already said, but past Dustin Pedroia, you should be looking for Pablo Sandoval to have a big impact in a cash game with his OBA at around .443 against right-handed throwers. Pushes him near the top of the third baseman, but he's in the heart of an order that should have a ton of runs scored. I think those are the most obvious names coming out at you, but let me just go through a couple cash plays that I like at each position and a couple GBP plays I like at each position, and we can go from there. All right, so obviously at pitcher for cash play games on a 1 to 2 pitcher site, you have to be looking at Scherzer, and you have to be looking at Cueto. At first base, obviously Agon, like I mentioned. You got Justin Bauer, you got Eric Hosmer, and Paul Goldschmidt. In first base, I wouldn't be looking too much past those. Maybe Prince Fielder if you want, but in cash game, I think that's where you draw the line. Second base, I think you're looking at Kipnis, Dustin Pedroia, D. Gordon, and Logan Forsythe. I think that those options should give you enough of the high range and the low range to be able to fill out your rosters as needed, and they're all bolstering great ISOs and weighted on base average against the handedness of the pitchers they're facing. Third base, like I mentioned, Pablo Sandoval, Matt Carpenter, Manny Machado, and Evan Longoria. Evan Longoria is astounding for cash play. His weighted on base is just outstanding this year against the handedness. I mean, if I was forming a team, I think Evan Longoria might be one of the first options I'm looking at if I'm not going with Pablo Sandoval. And I might only go with Pablo Sandoval in GPP options where I'm stacking, just because I like Evan Longoria so much. But I wouldn't be surprised if Pablo Sandoval finishes the night as the number one option. If I'm going to break it down in percentages of how I'm playing them, I would play Evan Longoria 60-40 to Pablo Sandoval in cash play. So at shortstop, you got Starlin Castro, Zach Cozart, Marcus Semien, and Johnny Peralta. I don't think that there's any options past that unless you're looking at stack options, but those are the four that I would target in cash games. They're the only four that have a good weighted on base average against their opponents and good, decent scenarios against semi-hittable pitchers. In the outfield, I'm actually looking at Chris Young of the Yankees, Ryan Gerchuk, Bryce Harper, Denard Span, and Chris Colabello. They're just so consistent against the handedness. They all have upside and power, and they just look like great options going into today's game. And at catcher, you got Miguel Montero, Stephen Vaught, Tucker Barnhart, and Nick Hundley. Barnhart might be a surprise, but since he's been up, he has been absolutely astounding. Those are the only names that I would look to stick at in cash play. All right, guys, that is it for episode 1 of the DFS First Look podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for checking out, and look to tomorrow for episode 2. All right, bye.